Welcome back, scholars. We're going to continue today talking about slavery in the United States, specifically slavery in the 1800s leading up to the Civil War. Today, we're going to be talking about how did slave owners control slaves and keep them from rebelling, but then we're also going to be learning about ways that slaves resisted work, either actively or passively, which, as you just learned, means like not doing it actively. And we're also going to be looking at some famous rebellions, like Nat Turner's slave rebellion that happens in Virginia in 1832. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Controlling slaves. Slavery was a system of forced labor that required slaveholders to keep slaves firmly under control for the system to work. Some slaveholders used harsh punishments like beating, whipping, branding, sexual violence, and other forms of torture to maintain that control. But punishments often backfired on slaveholders. A slave who had been badly whipped might not be able to work for some time, which means they're losing money. And harsh punishments were also likely to make slaves feel more resentful and rebellious. And if you don't know what branding is, this is we kind of learned. We talked about it in Chains when Isabel is branded on her face. So this is like where they kind of like burn hot iron rod and then they plant it onto your skin to burn a mark known as branding. All right, let's keep going. Slaveholders preferred to control their workforce by making slaves feel totally dependent on their masters. They also kept their workers as ignorant as possible about the world beyond the plantation, which is why it was illegal to teach slaves how to read or write, because education was seen as a tool to break their chains. Frederick Douglass's master said that a slave should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as it is told to do. Slaves who failed to learn this lesson were sometimes sent to slave breakers. Such men were experts at turning independent, spirited African Americans into humble, obedient slaves. When he was a teenager, Douglass was sent to be a slave breaker. Douglass was sent to a slave breaker named Edward Covey. Covey's methods consisted of equal parts violence, fear, and overwork. Douglass received his first whipping soon after he arrived on Covey's farm, and afterward he was beaten so often that aching bones and a sore back were my constant companions, meaning he was always sore because he was being beaten up multiple times by Edward Covey, the slave breaker. Let's keep going. Covey's ability to instill fear in his slaves was as effective as his whippings. Slaves never knew when he might be watching them. He would creep and crawl in ditches and gullies, Douglass recalled, to spy on his workers. Finally, Covey worked his slaves beyond endurance, meaning overworking them. Wrote Douglass, we worked all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first got there, but a few months of this discipline tamed me. I was broken in, body, soul, and spirit. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me. So as you guys can see, these slave breakers, by torture, violence, fear, and overworking them, would just break their soul, break them down where they would not want to rebel. Let's go ahead and continue. All right, resistance to slavery. So despite the efforts of slaveholders to crush their slave spirits, slaves found countless ways to resist their masters. As former slave Harriet Jacobs wrote after escaping to freedom, my master had power and law on his side. I had a determined will. There is power, might, in each. Day-to-day resistance. For most slaves, resistance took the form of quiet or passive acts of rebellion, so not doing it out in the open, being passive. So field hands, so field workers, would pull down fences, break tools, and work so sloppily that they damaged crops, while house slaves would sneak food out of the master's kitchen. So this was passive ways because they were doing it kind of like sly. Slaves pretended to be dumb, clumsy, sick, or insane to get out of work. For example, one slave avoided working for years by claiming to be nearly blind, only to regain his sight once he was freed. In some instances, resistance turned deadly when house servants put poison into slave owners' food. So many slaves set fire to their owners' homes and barns that the American Fire Insurance Company refused to insure property in the South. Crazy. So these were some examples of resistance. Most of these were passive, right? Like breaking the tools, working sloppily, pretending to be dumb or sick or clumsy, right? Those are passive. You're not just being openly defiant and saying, like, I'm not going to do the work. But we are going to go ahead and read about some of open defiance. Quiet resistance sometimes flared into open defiance. When pushed too hard, slaves refused to work. They rejected orders or struck back violently. Owners often describe slaves who reacted in this ways as insolent, which means disrespectful, or unmanageable. And if you can think back to when we read Chains, when she was branded, this is the word that she was branded on her face, insolent. So people would know that she was disrespectful, right? Once you get branded, you have that for life. It's like a tattoo. All right, Frederick Douglass reached his breaking point one day when the slave breaker Covey began to beat him for no particular reason. Rather than take the blows as he had done so many times before, Douglass fought back. Remember, Frederick Douglass is one of the most famous former slaves in American history, next to Harriet Tubman. All right, let's keep going. He wrestled Covey to the ground, holding him so firmly by the throat that his blood followed my nails. For Douglass, this moment was the turning point in my career as a slave. Let's go ahead and keep reading. So again, Douglass had him by the throat and like pushing his nails so deep into his skin that he made him bleed. Let's go ahead and read this. So this again, these are primary sources. When you see these quotes, this is from Douglass. So this is all like he's telling us how it happened. And he's going to tell us about his turning point in his career. Listen to that. Turning point in my career as a slave. My long crushed spirit rose. Cowardice departed. Bold defiance took its place. And I now resolve that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. Covey knew this and never laid a hand on Douglass again. Right? So talking here that Douglass knew that this Covey guy can't kill Frederick Douglass because slaves are worth money. And if he kills Frederick Douglass, he's going to lose money. So Douglass outsmarts Covey. Covey never expected slaves to fight back. So once Frederick Douglass does, he knows that if he starts whipping Douglass again, and Frederick Douglass is going to attack him, it could lead to Covey killing him, in which Covey would be losing lots of money. So that's why Covey never laid his hand on Douglass again. All right, so other ways that slaves resisted was running away. And some slaves tried to escape by running away to freedom in the North. The risks were enormous, and slave holders hired professional slave catchers and their packs of bloodhound dogs to hunt down runaway slaves. Although a runaway risked being mauled by dogs, brutally whipped, or maybe even killed if caught, Douglas and countless other slaves took the risk. Definitely worth it. Slaves found many ways to escape bondage. Some walked to freedom in the north, hiding by day and traveling at night when they would follow the North Star. Others traveled north by boat or train, using forged identity cards, and clever disguises to get past watchful slave patrols. And a few runaways even mailed themselves to freedom in boxes. Pretty incredible. Frederick Douglass is going to be one of these slaves that's going to escape to freedom using a forged identity card of someone else that said that he, like, of a free man. And it's kind of crazy. Frederick Douglass was almost caught, but luckily this chicken starts like causing chaos in the train, and the conductor guy, the porter, gives him back his ID and lets him go to freedom. Who knows what would happen with history in terms of civil rights and ending slavery, because Frederick Douglass was a huge leader of the movement, even meeting with Abraham Lincoln in the White House. So had he not been able to get to freedom, who knows what would have happened. Let's keep going. Thousands of runaways escaped to free states and to Canada with the help of the Underground Railroad, a secret network of free blacks and sympathetic whites. So whites who were against slavery and felt bad for these people and wanted to help them to freedom. The members of the Underground Railroad provided transportation and safe houses where runaways could hide. So again, one thing to know about the Underground Railroad is, one, it wasn't underground, and two, it wasn't a railroad. These were houses throughout the South and the North that were safe houses where they would hide runaway slaves during the day. All right, let's keep going. A number of guides or conductors risked their lives to help escaping slaves travel the freedom train. One of the most successful conductors was Harriet Tubman. Having escaped slavery herself, Tubman courageously returned to the South approximately 20 times between 1850 and 1860, guiding more than 300 men, women, and children to freedom. Rebellion. At times, resistance erupted into violent rebellion. Slave revolts occurred in cities, on plantations, and even on ships at sea. Fear of slave uprisings haunted slaveholders. Planters, wrote one visitor to the South, never lie down to sleep without loaded pistols at their sides. And you could probably guess, why would a slave owner sleep with a pistol loaded next to them? I think that's a pretty easy answer, right? Lots of paranoia of a slave rebellion and a slave uprising, where they would kill their masters and run away. All right, in 1822, authorities in Charleston, South Carolina, learned that Denmark Vesey, a free black, was preparing to lead a sizable revolt of slaves. Vesey, along with more than 30 slaves, were arrested and hanged, which means they killed them. And this was just they didn't even do it; they just heard about it. They were preparing for it. So look at that; they killed 31 people. And there's a ton of these. I'm reading this book, People's History of the United States, by Howard Zinn, and there's a chapter all about slave rebellions that are happening and how they work to put these down, which is why they were so harsh and killed these people right away to make an example out of them. But slaves are not going to give up, including Nat Turner. All right, 9 years later, in 1831, a slave named Nat Turner led a bloody uprising in Virginia in what became known as Nat Turner's Rebellion. Fascinating event history in American history. Turner and his followers set out to kill every white person that they could find. They were armed with axes and guns and they killed at least 57 people over a period of 2 days. Now, Vesey's and Turner's rebellions panicked white Southerners, and in response, Southern states are going to pass strict slave codes that tighten owners' control over their slaves and provided for even harsher punishment of slaves by authorities, which is like the state of Virginia or the state, the government, police, things like that, those authorities. As one frightened Virginian remarked, a Nat Turner might be in any family, meaning any like family of slaves that you own could have a person like Nat Turner who's going to just cause a rebellion and just start killing people. All right, y'all are gonna head on over to the next slide in a second, but before you do, I want to talk about like slave breakers. So here is a very, very famous photograph of a slave, and as you can see, these are all scar tissue from being whipped on the back by a slave breaker. So a very like hard image to look at, but very important for us to see these images so we can really get a perspective on how awful this institution of slavery was and all the things that made slaves want to rebel and want to start uprisings and revolts because of things like this happening to them. Alrighty, scholars, that is the end of the video. Y'all are going to go ahead and answer questions on the next slide, and then y'all are going to go ahead and start reading about what was life like for slaves in terms of leisure time, what about families and marriage and kids, as well as church. I'll see y'all back here on Wednesday. Have a great day.